and its implications without acknowledging climate justice would be to deny the lived experience of millions and maybe billions of people around the world. So this is a huge topic. I'm not going to be able to cover everything in it, nor what I'm covering to the depth that I think we should and should know about it, but I'm going to do my best, and I just think it's really important to do this to increase our awareness and to really increase our motivation to take action. As so much of what we discuss can sound daunting and we can feel really small in all of this, I wanted to open with this quote from the inarguable wisdom of Archbishop Tutu. It means a great deal to those who are oppressed to know that they are not alone. Never let anyone tell you that what you are doing is insignificant. I think I'm going to have that put on a plaque, or find it on a plaque and put it in my room. All right, so let's recall some of the theological underpinning of climate justice. Love thy neighbor, right? It's a concept that's not just coming up in the Bible once or twice. It's again and again and again. Like in Matthew 25, when you haven't done it for the least of these, you haven't done it for me. 1 John, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. Hebrews, show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. And Micah, what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Jarrett included a portion of the Belhar Confession as the affirmation of faith last week in Sunday service, and as we were reading it, it was just screaming at me that it was so relevant to today's class. So while the Belhar Confession derives from the apartheid struggle in South Africa, it really highlights the theological underpinning for any kind of justice work. So I'd like to read this portion to you. So this is only a portion of a larger document. So we believe that God has revealed, and I changed because of gender identity, God's self as the one who wishes to bring about justice and true peace among people. That God, in a world full of injustice and enmity, is in a special way the God of the destitute, the poor, and the wronged. That God calls the church to follow him in this, for God brings justice to the oppressed and gives bread to the hungry. That God frees the prisoner and restores sight to the blind. That God supports the downtrodden, protects the stranger, helps orphans and widows, and blocks the path of the ungodly. That for God, pure and undefiled religion is to visit the orphans and the widows in their suffering. That God wishes to teach the church to do what is good and to seek the right. That the church must therefore stand by people in any form of suffering and need, which implies, among other things, that the church must witness against and strive against any form of injustice, so that justice may roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That the church, as the possession of God, must stand where the Lord stands, namely against injustice and with the wronged. That in following Christ, the church must witness against all the powerful and privileged who selfishly seek their own interests and thus control and harm others. Pretty relevant to climate justice. The 2018 PCUSA General Assembly approved a new policy related to environmental racism and justice, and I want to highlight the last 2 points here. Number 3, listen to the perspectives and voices of people most impacted by environmental racism, with awareness to cultural diversity domestically and internationally. And number 4, in accordance with the gospel, position the church's approach to environmental problems to include responses to the voices most directly impacted by environmental racism. Now you'll recall that it was in 2006 that PCUSA churches were encouraged to go net zero. So I'm surprised this statement came so much later, but I'm glad it came. In general, the environmental movement, as we think of it, started as a largely white and privileged movement. The first Earth Day celebration in 1970 was not the diverse climate march that we see more of today. And most environmental organizations today talk about the importance of justice in their work and the importance of diverse voices in care for the earth. Still, I randomly Googled some staff photos of some of these organizations and was appalled to find that my favorite, the Nature Conservancy, in New York of all places, was mostly white. I did dig a little deeper, and the executive team is only 70% white. For as long as we humans have been capable of making decisions, there have been oppressed humans whose voices were excluded from the discussions. As we've highlighted before, in considering climate change, those most impacted and most harmed by climate impacts are not those in positions of power. These are people who largely do not have representation at the tables where decisions are made. As we explore environmental racism, environmental justice, and climate justice today, I want to highlight this brief but powerful article by Bill McKibben, John Wilson's hero, and a saint in climate action and creation care. In the article, McKibben notes the intersectionality of environmentalism, racism, and police violence. It reflects the layers and layers and layers of racism that are built into so many of our systems. McKibben points out that John Muir, considered often the father of environmentalism, when he said this quote, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find a hitch to everything else in the universe." He was talking about ecosystems, but this can be interpreted much more broadly. He notes that living in a polluted area and living in a community of high police violence are both conditions that have been shown to increase multiple health risks. Due in part to the citing of multiple environmental hazards, African Americans and Latinx Americans have notably higher levels of asthma and asthma deaths than do white Americans. The multiple forms of racism can compound each other. McKibben says, having a racist and violent police force in your neighborhood is a lot like having a coal-fired power plant in your neighborhood. And having both, and maybe some smoke pouring in from a nearby wildfire, well, the net effect, I can't breathe, is the daily condition of too many people in this country. One way or another, there are a lot of knees on a lot of necks. Before we dig into the concept of climate justice specifically, we should take a step back to consider its origin in environmental racism and the environmental justice movement. Key concepts to keep in mind as we explore the environmental justice movement are that environmental amenities and environmental burdens are not equally shared and distributed. This unequal distribution increased burdens and less benefits according to race is really the definition of environmental racism. So then the social justice movement that emerged from that is the environmental justice movement. I'm going to quote this Dr. Taylor from the Yale School of the Environment. In the US and globally, low-income, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian people tend to be living in spaces where environmental hazards, extreme natural and human-made disasters, and environmental degradation occur more rampantly. And Dr. Taylor goes on to say, the disproportionate distribution of environmental hazards to, quote, the poorest, brownest, and blackest people is no coincidence, but that it is by design. Okay, this is a 3-minute video that defines environmental racism and environmental justice so well that I thought it would be worth watching. It also gives you a sneak peek into some of the climate justice issues we'll be considering this morning. I did learn about this video and its inclusion in a PC USA webinar on environmental justice, so it's been pre-approved.
Okay, so this is a city. Here are all the people living in it, people of all different colors, ages, wealths, and incomes. Except they don't all live together in the same place. They're separated into different parts of the city by what color they are, what language they speak, and how much money they have. And those different parts of the city look quite different. The parts that are whiter and wealthier tend to have green spaces, grocery stores with nutritious organic food, and of course the money to buy it, and are often far away from pollution-emitting freeways. The parts that are poorer and more diverse tend to have industrial sites, heavy-duty diesel-polluted ports and highways, and hazardous waste, all things that the city relies on to run properly, but that heavily pollute the air and water. And even if they had those grocery stores with nutritious organic food, most residents there couldn't afford it anyway. How did this happen? Well, this segregation can be traced back to race-based zoning and housing policies, but it wasn't always as deliberate as plain old racism. Some separations can simply be traced to poor land use planning. And as a result, these residents of the same city live very different lives. Say the city realizes it has an emissions problem. It comes up with a plan to reduce air pollution, plant more trees to suck up the carbon, or start a cap-and-trade program. But those trees get planted in the neighborhoods that are already green, and the factories that are spewing toxins into the air just buy more carbon offsets and keep spewing their toxins. The benefits of these programs are enjoyed by the communities that are already doing just fine, and the communities that were hurting most from all that air pollution, well, they're still hurting. This isn't just an imaginary city, this is the story of real cities all across the US, where people might live in the very same area code, but their race, ethnicity, or wealth and income bracket causes them to experience wildly different quality of air, water, and life. In fact, it can even mean that they also experience different deaths. That's how serious this stuff is. This kind of inequity expands far beyond cities, too. Rural areas are full of commercially valuable resources like oil and coal, and they're also home to indigenous and low-income communities. But when those resources are extracted, those communities don't see any of the money, and they end up with all the air and water contamination that's left over from the extraction. And we even see this injustice on a global level, like in small island nations that are forced to directly confront the consequences of rising sea levels, but haven't played any significant role in the industries that are causing climate change. These peoples are sometimes forced to flee their homes because their land is literally going underwater. But the very states that did play a hand in creating climate change don't have migration policies to accommodate them. So when we talk about environmental justice, we're talking about how we can try to break down and reimagine a system that's built up on these inequities. A system where those who are already disadvantaged because of their race and economic status are made poor because they're unable to profit from the resources that the world depends on, and are made sick or worse by the environmental contamination that comes with extracting those resources. Social inequities are intimately tied to the environment. That's why social justice is an environmental issue too.
There's so much packed into that video. I hope I can help break it down.
Okay, so
I do this every time, don't I? Alright, slideshow. Okay. And so environmental justice is really the intersection of environmentalism and civil rights. So today, speaking about environmentalism without getting into environmental justice and the social justice implications of it is really outdated and inadequate. And it was here in North Carolina, in Warren County, where the United States first saw the important relationship between environmentalism and civil rights. This is a historical marker that stands at Highway 401 in Warrenton, North Carolina, to mark the protests that took place there in 1982. It all started in 1978 when 31,000 gallons of PCBs were illegally dumped along roadways in rural eastern North Carolina. The state had to get rid of this toxic roadside soil, so it bought farmland in Warren County. Keep in mind that at that time, I went back to the records, the North Carolina population was about 22% black, but Warren County was approximately 60% black. For 4 years, the group Warren County Citizens Concerned About PCBs fought the landfill in the legal courts, the court of public opinion. They pressed Governor Hunt to find a more suitable location where they might not have to waive all of these regulations by the EPA that they waived in order to place the landfill where they placed it. But still, by 1982, the landfill was ready to receive the truckloads of PCB contaminated soil. By this point, the concerned citizens decided to change tack a bit and recruited religious leaders who were veterans of the civil rights movement and experienced in nonviolent protests to help fight for their cause. This was a wonderfully multiracial and intergenerational coalition who stood in protest to the dumping of carcinogenic PCBs at the landfill site. 55 protesters laid in the road to block the dump truck's approach and were arrested for their civil disobedience. And a powerful movement was born, the environmental justice movement. I want to share with you just a brief segment of this wonderful little documentary about this by the people who lived it themselves. Remind myself what time, 2:20 to 3:40. I'm gonna just play it right here.
And the church played a significant role in being a hub.
What does God require us but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God? So they saw that as part of what God required them to do, to stand up against injustice.
Just the audacity of someone who comes and just dumps in your community, and the Bible says, do unto others as they have done to you.
Only thing we could do was to raise our voices and to stand up against what we knew was an injustice. We were really not trying to start a movement. It turned into a movement.
I think I was inspired that day. For some reason, I was working in Raleigh and had only asked off for a day, thinking I was going to participate.
Children was a part of it. My own 8-year-old daughter, who I thought was going to school, and she said, well, I'm going to go with you to protest. And as a mother, you know, I knew that the trucks would be carrying toxic waste and wasn't sure that I would be safe, and certainly didn't want to put her in any danger, but I couldn't say to her, this is worth put my life on the line for, and this is something you can't stand up for too. It was about justice.
During that march, time.
All right, in the United States alone, there are far too many examples like the one in the Warren County landfill. So this is just a sampling of some of the myriad examples of environmental racism in our own country. Cancer Alley is an 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, where the people who live there are predominantly Black, and the incidence of cancer is 50 times higher than in other Americans. You remember the Flint, Michigan water crisis, where people were lead poisoned because the city didn't do the proper treatment after they changed water supplies. Also in Michigan, the air pollution in Detroit, its most polluted zip code, is over 71% Black, and the air pollution is so bad, and I took this quote from an article, it can make the sky look like a fiery orange glare. That can't be good. The Bronx is New York's most diverse borough, and the South Bronx is known as Asthma Alley, where hospitalizations are 5 times the national average, and at 21 times the rate of other New York City neighborhoods. A study of landfill sites in Houston in 1979, this was performed by Robert Bullard, who's considered often the father of environmental justice, found that the landfills were not randomly scattered, but they were likely to be in predominantly Black neighborhoods and near Black schools. The Arrowhead landfill in Uniontown, Alabama receives coal ash waste from Tennessee, and that's a largely minority community. So these are examples of serious environmental injustice. So let's zero in now on the concept of climate justice. What does climate injustice look like? It's the droughts, the floods, the rising sea levels, the storm damage, striking people of color and low-income communities the worst. In many cases, climate justice is an intensifying of vulnerabilities already present in a given community. Reminiscent of the overlap of environmentalism and civil rights that gave us environmental justice, the intersection of climate change and social justice is where climate justice resides. And it's really a branch of environmental justice that is rightfully in the foreground today, as climate change is our greatest environmental emergency and is fueling massive social justice emergencies. So Mary Robinson, who I mentioned last week, the former president of Ireland and UN Special Envoy on Climate Change and author of the book Climate Justice, which I have if you want to look at it here, defines climate justice for us. Climate justice insists on a shift from a discourse on greenhouse gases and melting ice caps into a civil rights movement with the people and communities most vulnerable to climate impacts at its heart. Climate justice recognizes the climate crisis as a social and political problem as well as an environmental one. It acknowledges that different communities feel the effects of the climate crisis differently, and that the responsibility for the crisis rests with some countries and companies more than others. And it understands that the lives of those already facing injustice and oppression are made harder by the impacts of the climate crisis. Climate justice is about fighting for solutions to the climate crisis that not only reduce emissions, but also create a fairer and more just world. So let's look at Hurricane Katrina as a domestic case study in environmental injustice. Most of us probably recall the horrifying images that were the storm and recovery in and around New Orleans. A 2011 study determined that 93% of those stranded in the days following the storm were Black. Damage disproportionately affected communities of color. This is one major example of the severe and disproportionate impacts of climate change in the US. You probably recall the horrendous conditions in and around the Superdome, which was intended to be a place of refuge during and following Katrina. And to review some of the injustice in the storm recovery, I want to highlight the story of Sharon Hanshaw from East Biloxi, Mississippi, as told in Mary Robinson's Climate Justice book. Sharon was a cosmetologist turned climate justice activist in the wake of the storm and failed recovery. Her hair salon and rented home were destroyed during Katrina. For 5 months, she lived with her daughter in Gulfport and returned to Biloxi when she was able to move into a FEMA trailer, which we know there were problems with that. She watched as what was left of her salon and her home and her community's damaged homes were razed to build a parking lot of the Imperial Palace Casino. So casinos in Mississippi had to be off-land prior to Katrina. They were on barges, boats, and piers. But very quickly after Katrina, they changed the law so that casinos could come on land as long as they were within 800 feet of the shore. That was largely minority communities that were then destroyed to build these casinos again. Governor Barber of Mississippi requested that Washington, this is ridiculous to me, waive the requirement that any percentage of the recovery package given to Mississippi be spent to benefit low-income households. Basically, the devastating impacts of the storm were compounded by the inefficiency and the inequity of the disaster response. A national poll a week after the storm made landfall found that 2/3 said the government's response to the situation would have been faster if most of the victims had been white. That was 2/3 of African Americans, and 17% of whites agreed. Major disconnect here, right? A decade after the storm hit, the differences in attitudes about the impact of Hurricane Katrina linger. In a 2015 survey, the Kaiser Family Foundation and NPR did their 4th post-hurricane survey of New Orleans residents. And for the most part, both Black and white residents expressed optimism about the city's future. But while 70% of the whites said the city had mostly recovered from Katrina, just 44% of African Americans agreed. So these two groups are experiencing two very different realities. Now we're going to visit the other side of the world and consider climate justice issues in the Pacific Islands. I'm focusing your attention here on Tuvalu, which I did not even know existed until last fall. It's just north of Fiji, and Pastor Jarrett and I attended a talk by Maina Talia, a climate justice advocate from Tuvalu, in October at Kirk of Kildare in Peary. And his story was so compelling, it was one of the main reasons I wanted us to do another Sunday school series. So I want to introduce you to Tuvalu and the Tuvaluans. Is it hard if I just leave it in the screen? Is it better if I make it big? Do you guys care? I obviously transition better if I just leave it there.
This is my island. These are my people. And this is our life.
Like Tuvalu, because it's a land where I born and I grew up there, and I never want to leave Tuvalu.
Our ancestors settled these islands 3,000 years ago. They lived off the land, growing their own crops and tending to their livestock. They fished in the sea, and we do the same. At the end of the day, we rest just as they did.
Tuvalu, like any other country, is dear to its citizens. We are very friendly people. We live in peace. You can sleep with the doors unlocked and be assured that you get up in the morning to a nice sunrise and to a happy smile by anybody who passes you by.
Recently,
Alright, got better at that. Okay. So Maya Natalia showed us a video of a wave on a sunny day that brought seawater over the entirety of one of the Tuvaluan islands. His nation is, as we sometimes say, sinking as sea levels rise. This raises issues of food and water security, migration concerns, and political implications of relocation. He articulates clearly the statement, "We do not want to move," but also recognizes that it may be an inevitability. He also noted how difficult this is for his Christian community, especially the older generation who's less educated and doesn't understand climate change. They feel that God is punishing them, even though God promised after the flood in Genesis, "Never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done." They wonder what they did wrong. This is Tuvalu's foreign minister, Simon Kofi, speaking on some of these issues in 2022.
The Pacific.
Getting there. Oops.
Now, how do we re-emphasize again the importance of climate change as an issue that should be on the agenda all the time?
Is New Zealand a strong enough climate change partner for Tuvalu?
Well, I think there's always more that can be done. I think that's the message I guess I want to put forward to New Zealand, Australia, and some of the bigger countries. Tuvalu and other countries that are low-lying are facing the full brunt of climate change, although we contributed very little to the problem. And so I think it's an issue of justice as well, that some of these bigger countries that are contributing to the problem need to provide the support. There are many projects that they could do with more funding, like building sea walls, protecting our coastal areas, reclaiming land. And that's something that we hear about as well with countries like Tuvalu on the international plane, advocating for greater flexibility in finances coming to the region.
So more cash and investment from New Zealand wouldn't go amiss.
Exactly, that's right. Tuvalu has been looking into the future in a scenario where we are forced to relocate or our islands are fully submerged. Do we still consider ourselves a state? Can we have the right to vote in some of these international bodies? Do we have claims to our EEZ and the resources in our waters? So we're looking long term, and we want to ensure that we find legal avenues now to be able to secure our statehood under international law. Obviously, this never happened in the history because we've never had a country disappear because of climate change. So it's a totally new area under international law that Tuvalu is pioneering, and we're hoping that other countries come on board as well to accept this.
I just find that putting a face to these issues makes it so much more powerful and real. So Tuvaluans are in good company as they contemplate the need to migrate in the face of climate change. In February 2021, President Biden signed an executive order rebuilding and enhancing programs to resettle refugees and planning for the impact of climate change on migration. This directed the National Security Advisor to prepare a report on the topic. So the 37-page report is the first time the United States government has officially reported on the link between climate change and migration. On average, 21.5 million people were forcibly displaced each year by sudden onset weather-related hazards between 2008 and 2016. It's a pretty big number. And thousands more were displaced by slow onset hazards linked to climate change. In climate justice, we hear the terms adaptation and mitigation a lot. Adaptation is making adjustments and investments in how we live now to be more resilient in the face of damage in the future. And mitigation refers to the responses to damage that has already occurred. So the reasons for climate migration range from proactive adaptation, I need to move or I will face certain hardship, to forced mobility in the face of a disaster. Like the Tuvaluans, most people don't want to leave their homes. And if possible, migrants generally prefer to stay in their home country. The cross-border migrations are often as a result of unsafe situations in migrants' country of origin. Since climate change can cause or exacerbate resource scarcity, it can make internal migration unsafe. So this is one example of the impetus for a cross-border migration. We're talking mostly about climate migrants here, but we should also acknowledge that there are people who cannot migrate in spite of serious climate impacts in their lives, perhaps due to disability or lack of resources. So these are referred to as trapped populations. And when we refer to migrants as climate refugees, it's important to note that as of now, climate refugees have no protection under domestic, regional, or international laws related to refugee and asylum. In 2020, refugees around the world exceeded 100 million, tripling from 2010, and half were children. This means 1 in every 78 people have been forced to flee. With every 1 degree Celsius temperature increase, roughly 1 billion people will be pushed outside the zone in which humans have lived for thousands of years. So larger and larger portions of that 100 million of migrants will be climate migrants as the climate continues to change. And it can be difficult, though, to isolate climate change as the primary reason behind a person's decision to leave their home. And this is especially true in regions rife with poverty, conflict, and violence. For example, in El Salvador, people relocate from rural to urban areas due to repeated crop failures from floods or droughts. Once in the city, though, they become victims of gang violence and then flee for their lives. Migrants are trying to improve their lives, as we all do by moving, and some are migrating to save their lives. While people can be made migrants overnight by a sudden disaster, more often the impacts of climate breakdown on people's lives are gradual. Another poor harvest or another season of unbearable heat, which becomes the catalyst that pushes people to seek a better location. So migrants' individual stories, just like the Tuvaluan stories, always resonate louder than the statistics. So I want to introduce you to Cesar, who is a 19-year-old Honduran immigrant, and Adela. This is an Al Jazeera film. And Adela, I'm not going to play the whole story of her because it's very long. So I'm going to give you a little background. She left her home with her husband and children with the caravan that you probably remember in 2018. It was lots of farm workers who were leaving due to a drought that ruined about 80% of the crops in the region. So the caravan then was turned forcibly around at the by Mexican authorities as they were shooting tear gas at the migrants. So Adela returned home with her family, and soon after, Hurricane Iota hit and leveled her house. So it's multiple things piling up against these people. And I'm going to note for you, so a lot of this is in Spanish and is subtitled. If you have any trouble reading it, just shout and I'll pause it and I'll read it out loud. Some of it's in English, but not all of it. So we're going to start from the beginning here.
No, Ingrid, para ti y para tu
That's
tía.
not the beginning.
Bueno, pues la verdad que un poco nervioso porque voy a
Is it too
ser
hard to
aquí,
read? No? Okay, thank you.
pero tengo que hacerlo porque no tengo otra opción.
When we met Cesar in Honduras, he had been walking for 3 days, the beginning of a long and dangerous journey to the United States.
¿Por qué te fuiste? ¿Qué pasó? No tengo casa, no tengo familia, no tengo donde trabajar.
Cesar is 19. He told us he left home after he was fired from his job on a ranch because some of the cattle that he cared for had died. He says there was not enough water for the cows to drink. Central America has gotten hotter and drier over the last few decades, and Honduras is now going through a severe drought.
Bueno, más antes los ríos no se secaban como ahora. Ya no. Ahora ya estamos en un clima que no sé ni realmente cómo es. Ahora está más cambiada la situación.
All right, now we're going to move to Adela.
For nearly a year, they've lived at this camp with 21 other families who survived the hurricane.
Esta es mi casa por ahorita.
They now sleep in this shipping container.
Aquí duerme quién?
En la cama solo la niña duerme, nosotros dormimos en el suelo, en un colchón. Es triste a veces tener que vivir aquí como encerrado. Durante el día, todo el día no podemos estar dentro de ellos porque ni aún de la mitad para adentro no puede pasar uno porque siente como que ni tengo explicación cómo siente uno que quema.
¿Y podrán irse de aquí pronto? ¿Les han dicho algo?
Yo no sé si antes nos van a llevar para el otro lado o no sé qué va a pasar. No sé.
Adela grows food to feed her family, but her crops failed from the lack of rain. So she weaves and sells hammocks, and even then, it's barely enough to survive.
¿Cómo ves tu futuro?
Pues seguramente y tengo entendido que yo creo que no tengo futuro. Porque solo lo que voy haciendo es trabajo, lo que trabajo en esta misma semana lo vendo y solo para ir pasando. No podemos, porque adelante con lo que hacemos solo para ir pasando nomás, porque uno siempre no le faltan las deudas, siempre debe algo, una cosa a alguien o a otro poquito y así va y lo que hace más bien ni le ajusta. Entonces no digamos ya para tener que comprar un solar o irlo pagando o hacer una casita, no creo.
Okay, so what does this mean for the destination communities like the United States? I know this is really worried, but I thought these quotes were really helpful. From an article from the PBS NewsHour, there is still this idea in the global north, our idea, that people come here because they're fleeing poverty and seeking a better life, the American dream. But we've got to approach climate displacement as a human security issue and not a border security issue. And from Sarah Bermeo, a friend of mine, a professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke, destination communities will need resources to handle increased demand for services such as healthcare and education, and to ease short-term pressures on housing and infrastructure. Research shows that migrants become productive members of their new communities, contributing to the economy and paying taxes that help support government provision of infrastructure and services. Over time, these benefits are strong, but in the short term, adjustment costs are real and can be daunting for destinations receiving many migrants in a short period. Further, the White House report on climate change and migration concluded with the recommendation to establish a standing interagency policy process on climate change and migration that brings together representatives across the scientific, development, humanitarian, and peace and security elements of the United States government. So hopefully they'll take that report seriously. I think they're going to be forced to if they don't. The major topics in climate justice are presented and discussed annually at the United Nations COPs. The 27th COP convened in Egypt in November 2022 and was a newsmaker. During COP27, there were high-level and side events, negotiations, speeches, appeals, and press conferences. More than 100 heads of state and governments were attended, and over 35,000 participants were there overall. And as I learned in an Interfaith Power and Light webinar about COP27, the COP cover decision is the document that articulates what was decided in the current COP. For the first time in 30 years of COPs, loss and damages was in the cover decision in 2022. So let's talk about what that is. Loss and damage refers to the impacts of climate change, especially on nations that contributed almost nothing to the problem. This ranges from clearly monetizable damages and losses to damage that's nearly impossible to quantify. The Loss and Damage Fund is an attempt to answer the question, how do we compensate people who contributed next to nothing to climate change for the harsh, life-altering impacts? The commitment means that wealthier nations agreed to provide support to poorer nations more affected by climate change, and these are like reparations for past ills. The establishment of a Loss and Damage Fund is really the epitome of climate justice. Okay, so I had to play this 1-minute sort of celebratory video from the UN.
I'm here to appeal to all parties to rise to this moment and to the greatest challenge that humanity is facing.
Today, here in Sharm el-Sheikh, we established the first ever dedicated fund for loss and damage, a fund that has been so long in the making.
I ask us today, what will our choice be? We have the power to act or the power to remain passive and do nothing. Our people on this earth deserve better. And what is more, our leaders know better. The choice is ours. What will you do? What will you choose to say?
And that Mia Motley from the Barbados, her entire speech is pretty awesome if you have any inclination to watch. All right, so that was good news from COP27, and there was a lot of good news, but there was also some bad news from certain perspectives. And I'm drawing this perspective largely from an Eco America webcast about COP27, in which Jessica Maudlin, who was a representative of PC USA at the COP, shared her takeaways from Egypt. So first and foremost is the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund. First time that's happened. And then it was celebrated that they really kept to the let's try to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius limit of temperature rise, and just urged parties to double down. I think there was some fear that they would kind of let that creep up, saying we're not doing very well, let's make it a 2-degree limit. But they're really trying to stick to that. And one really important point, Indigenous peoples had a seat and a voice in the inner circle for the first time. They've been attending COP since the beginning, but they've never been invited into the inner circle where the decisions were made. So that happened this year, or last year. Before the meeting happened, there was talk that COP27 was going to be the COP of implementation, that a lot of discussion and important ideas came out of Glasgow the previous year. But there were questions afterwards, was it really the COP of implementation? Lots of lofty commitments were made, but the detailed plans were absent. Other things COP27 was criticized for that were not in the final document were any discussion of peaking emissions before 2025, clear follow-through on phasing out coal, and a clear commitment to phase out all fossil fuels. And I wonder, did that have anything to do with the presence of 636 representatives of the fossil fuel industry that attended COP27? Hope not. Anyway. So what can we do? So this is from Jessica Maudlin again, speaking on that Eco America webinar about, it's called Let's Talk Climate. There are lots of them, by the way, with all different topics. She says, people at home can make a difference. A year ago was the time to make your voice heard for COP27. So we can speak now as people of faith to influence COP28. We need to be speaking to our representatives now, not a year from now. Even if there aren't issues before our own government in this moment, we need to be communicating with our representatives. Let them know we're paying attention, we care, and we want to be good global citizens. This graphic from Yale Sustainability is a good succinct place to start too on what can we do. Get educated, amplify voices and solutions, donate time and/or money, and hold your local officials accountable. We keep saying it, it's so important. I'm going to end here for today with this image of all able hands coming together to work on these critical issues. We'll pick up more on what we can all do about this and all that we've covered in these Sunday school classes in 2 weeks. We're not going to be on Easter. So we'll see you April 16th for a wrap-up and discussion of that. I saved a little time for discussion if anybody wants to have anything to share or thoughts. Oh my gosh, we're quiet today. I did bring a few books that I thought I found really relevant to this topic if you're at all interested. Mary Robinson's book is over there. It's really a short read, and it's largely case studies about different climate justice issues. And I thought that was a really nice, easy read. I'm going to highlight also the All We Can Save book that I showed previously, that Soil Ode to Dirt, the poem about soil was from. I loved that book so much, and partly it's a collection of writings by all female environmental justice, all kinds of things related, like experts in that field related to environmental justice and climate justice. And a large percentage of the writers are people of color too. So it in of itself is a kind of social justice book. But
can I just, let me say it and you correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm trying to just get my mind around environmental justice versus climate justice. Environmental justice is we collectively, humans, and our relationship to this planet, and climate is our relationship amongst one another as humans to humans.
I think,
within
yes, and
impacts.
I think climate justice is specifically environmental justice related to climate change impacts. So it's kind of like a subtopic under environmental justice, but it's really pushed to the forefront because, I mean, what's our greatest concern and the greatest ill that we're facing? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's
Sure.
just trying to make sure I get those right.
Yeah.
So in North Carolina, is there any talk or any effort to try to relocate some of the people that keep getting?
It's a great question that I don't know the answer for, but I was ready to invite Adela and all her 8 kids and her husband into my home.
I'm sure.
Yes, it does make you, for me it really made the refugee crisis and the crisis at the border relate so much more to something that's so dear to my heart. And illuminate how, you think about climate change, the changing, the environmental impacts, but so many political issues and social issues in our world today that are so big and important actually have a grounding in impacts from climate change. So no, I'm sorry, I don't know specifically if anybody has any information on that.
Well, so Cindy, I'm not sure if this is a question, but anyway, for instance, the town of Princeville, which is in eastern North Carolina, what is that, the Neuse River, I guess, with the various storms over the past, has flooded. And so, off and on, there's been talk of relocating Princeville. I don't know where it stands now, actually, but obviously, and Princeville is a historic community. It was founded after the Civil War, and it was sort of a black created, black governed town. So there's a lot of history to it, but it's right next to, close to a river, and so it floods, and so there's been talk of what to do with Princeville. Others may know more than I. See Emily leaning in. So yeah.
The only thing that I've seen about Princeville recently is, I'm trying to think what voice it was, something I was listening to. They don't want to leave.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So I think the whole idea of adaptation.
Yeah.
If there are structural things that can change to help improve their plight, that would certainly be their preference.
The other thing I just noticed, and it's a discussion on the North Carolina coast, was one of the gentlemen from Tuvalu mentioned it sounded like seawalls, which may be advantageous there. They have been, have been much discussed along the North Carolina coast, and they bring their own issues. And so there is some concern about doing them along the North Carolina coast. And John would actually may be able to say more, but it's been sort of thought as not a good thing in these parts.
Yeah, I really felt in that video like that is a last ditch effort.
Right, exactly.
That is sort of like the last stand of the Alamo when the inevitable is about to happen.
And I feel like he knew that in saying it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but the issues of, who are we if we don't have our land? And there's so many implications from that. And their maritime boundaries, who owns that? And
Just one more thing, picking up on something that John just said, the Conservation Trust for North Carolina has a big program that it helps spearhead called the Princeville Collaborative. In the face of climate change, communities use conservation techniques to rebuild with resilience. So CTNC has been very involved, and other conservation groups have been very involved in Princeville for all the reasons John mentioned. So if you're interested, I'll put this link in the additional resources document.
If I remember correctly, I want to say with Tuvalu, it's the maritime boundaries is actually something that, you know, the driving it in not in their favor, wasn't it? That it's very valuable fishing water.
Because maritime boundaries are based on like distance from the land.
Right.
So when the land goes under, is that just international waters now?
Right. But I wanted to say, like, was it China? There's like, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
We want to fish those waters. So
Count on China.
It's terrible, but you know, but there's and I don't mean to pick on China there. It's just like there's always self-interest pulling in the other direction from a lot of these justice questions.
Right, the economics.
Makes it hard.